Please, not again." The words barely left her mouth before she broke down. It was late 1945, inside a temporary British medical tent, canvas thick with damp and antiseptic, heavy with a war that had ended on paper but still lived inside everyone present. Before we go further, a quick note. Stories like this are shared daily, drawn from real accounts of war and survival. Subscribe so you never miss them. Now back to the story, back to the tent where silence weighed more than the equipment and fear sat quietly. A German female prisoner named Analisa sat rigid on a narrow bed, her back to the entrance. Her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white, drained of color like the world around her, as if even color itself had not survived the war. She arrived that morning with dozens of others, processed with mechanical efficiency, catalogued, numbered, and moved along. She said nothing, not a word. She nodded when required, moved when directed, and kept her eyes lowered as she had learned to do. The camp sprawled across tents and hastily built wooden structures, erected after Germany's surrender. Prisoners flooded in as units collapsed, and soldiers surrendered en masse or were captured fleeing eastward from advancing Soviet forces. Analisa had arrived before dawn, packed into a military truck with 50 other women. All wore the same exhausted resignation. All had learned resistance was pointless, and compliance was the only strategy that might keep you alive another day. When the British medic stepped closer, boots dull against wooden planks laid over mud, she froze completely. Every muscle locked tight. Not mere tension, but something deeper, carved into her nervous system through repetition and trauma. The moment his hand touched her back, gentle and clinical, she screamed. The sound tore from her chest and collapsed her forward onto the bed, sobbing in violent gasps that shook her frame and shattered the tent's fragile order. The tent fell silent in that uncomfortable way when no one knows where to look. Other prisoners shifted on benches. Some stared. Others turned away, understanding too well what kind of trauma could create a reaction like that. Guards moved instinctively, hands drifting toward weapons, trained by years where sudden movement meant danger. They assumed resistance or protest. One young soldier reached to restrain her, thinking the episode needed control. The medic stepped back at once, hands raised. His voice cut through the tension, calm but firm, ordering the guard to stand down. "This wasn't defiance or danger," he said quietly. "This was terror, raw and unmistakable." His name was Thomas Whitmore, a veteran of 4 years with the Royal Army Medical Corps. He had treated shattered bodies and broken men, but he hadn't expected fear like this from a routine examination in a medical tent. The meaning of her scream struck him with physical force. It wasn't pain she feared, it was touch itself. Hands arriving without warning from behind, unseen. Hands that memory had taught her never meant safety or care. The war had trained her body well. Sudden contact meant violence or violation. Panic lived in her bones now, long after danger passed. Her reaction wasn't choice, it was conditioning, etched deep by repetition and survival. Analisa had been conscripted in late 1944 as Germany collapsed. She worked communications as units retreated west, watching friends die or disappear. In the final weeks, things happened that she would never fully speak about. Those experiences taught her body one lesson above all others. Unexpected touch was the beginning of something terrible. Even now, safe on paper, her instincts screamed louder than reason or uniforms or the war's official end. Thomas did something unusual for 1945. He spoke softly, explaining each step before moving. In careful English, then broken German, he told her what he needed to do and promised not to touch her without warning. His accent was thick, his German clumsy, learned from a phrase book. But the meaning was clear. He would stop if she asked. He would wait. He needed permission. And then, astonishingly, he waited. Minutes passed. A line of patience grew. Schedules slipped. But he stood there, hands visible, posture open. Something in her scream had pierced the armor he'd built over years of battlefield medicine. For the first time since capture, no one rushed her. No orders were barked, no threats followed, hesitation. She was told she had a choice, and that choice broke something loose inside her chest. After several long minutes, she nodded. Thomas stayed where he was, giving her space. He made himself smaller somehow, approaching with the caution used for wounded animals that had learned to expect cruelty instead of care. She turned slightly so she could see him, his face, his hands, their position at all times. That small measure of control mattered, even as she remained a prisoner, subject to foreign rules and shifting moods beyond her reach. Her eyes were red and hollow with exhaustion. She hadn't slept properly in weeks, maybe months. Adrenaline and fear had carried her this far, and now the absence of immediate danger left her unsteady and unsure. Thomas narrated every movement before making it, asking permission each time. To the guards it looked absurd, but he persisted. He treated her not as a number to process, but as a person whose fear was real. He examined her back, finding bruises days old, likely from transport. Painful but not severe. Time and rest would heal them. He checked her breathing, listened to her lungs, and asked about other injuries slowly. The assessment followed regulation, but at her pace. Each step gave her time to prepare, to brace herself, to remain present. The guards relaxed, returning to their posts, watching now with quiet confusion. Decades later, Analisa would tell her daughter this was the moment everything shifted. Not because of medicine, but because she felt safe enough to believe the war might truly be over at last. Touch, for the first time in months, hadn't meant threat. It hinted that rules could change, that bodies might belong to themselves again, that survival might someday turn back into living. She spent months afterward in camp routines. Laundry duty roll calls, thin soup and bread, waiting for reviews and signatures. But that moment stayed with her as proof something human had survived. It told her not everything had been destroyed. That beneath propaganda and dehumanization, a thread of decency remained, fragile but real, holding against the machinery of total war. The camp settled into routine, dawn roll calls, assigned labor, endless waiting. Meals were scarce but reliable, more than she'd known at war's end. Life existed in a strange limbo, neither free nor truly imprisoned. She never saw Thomas Whitmore again, never thanked him, never explained what his patience meant. But the memory traveled with her into the long work of rebuilding a life from fragments and losses. Analisa was released in early 1946 with papers, a little money, and directions to a processing center. She returned home to rubble. Her apartment stood open to daylight, walls shattered, family gone without answers. There was no way to know who had survived. She found work in a restaurant kitchen, married a widower from Dresden, raised children in a new Germany that rarely spoke plainly about the past. She became a grandmother, known for kindness and holiday baking. The war years remained mostly unspoken, reduced to hints and silences that her children sensed but never fully understood. Thomas Whitmore died in 1987. He carried countless moments like hers, rarely shared. Years later, his granddaughter found his journals while sorting his belongings in the quiet of an attic. One entry from November 1945 mentioned a German prisoner who taught him the difference between treating injuries and treating people, and how war damaged more than flesh and bone. He wrote that the moment changed his medicine. It taught him to slow down, to make space for fear and grief, to see the unseen wounds carried into every examination room. After the war, he practiced in Yorkshire, delivering babies, setting bones, sitting with the dying. The lessons from that tent followed him into every quiet, human exchange. Sometimes, he wrote, the most important act was waiting, offering choice where none had existed, treating each person as worthy of dignity, regardless of uniform or history. The granddaughter felt a mix of pride and grief reading those journals. Pride in his compassion, grief for all the stories never shared, moments of connection and humanity locked away from the family he loved, kept private in the pages of his life. She wondered about the woman in the tent. Had she survived, found peace, lived a long life? The answers remained unknown, lost in time and history, separate yet tied to that single moment of gentleness and patience. Analisa had indeed survived. She lived a long life, died peacefully in 1998, surrounded by children and grandchildren, strong but rarely recounting the hardships, the specifics of war kept quietly in her memory. The two families, medic and former prisoner, remained unknown to each other, separated by geography and history. Yet they were forever linked by that single act of human decency in a temporary medical tent in 1945, a moment that rippled forward through both lives, neither fully aware of the influence it would carry. Small kindness against machinery of war, showing that even in chaos, individuals could choose humanity. The war had created an environment of cruelty and fear, yet individual people could still act differently. One patient, one medic, one patient's choice, all combined into a fragile pocket of safety and dignity. Analisa's life after the camp carried forward the lessons of survival, resilience, and cautious trust. Her days in post-war Germany were ordinary, but shadowed by memories of fear, trauma, and that rare instance of understanding. Thomas continued his work, treating patients with attentiveness, informed by the tent experience. Years of practice in Yorkshire were quietly shaped by a lesson learned in war: human decency matters as much as medicine. The granddaughter would never meet Analisa, yet reading the journals connected her to the past in ways she couldn't have imagined. Humanity, compassion, patience, they transcended war, distance, and generations.